Peace and blessings, everyone. Shalom, salam alaikum. Welcome to Universal God Message of Peace. I'm Lale Tuncer. This is Rabbi Lee Weissman, and we have Dr. Khalid Zaheer. And welcome to our weekly Abrahamic dialogue session. This week, the topic is who gets salvation? And Rabbi Weissman will be starting this week. So it's such a big topic, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing his perspective on this. So over to you, Rabbi Weissman.
Okay, it is a very big topic, and I decided I would let Rabbi Google answer the question. So I headed to Rabbi Google, and I said, "Oh, Rabbi Google," and now Rabbi Google is also, is also powered by ChatGPT. So I have Rabbi Google and ChatGPT all at the same time. And I said, "Oh, Rabbi Google, answer my question. According to Judaism, who gets salvation?" And the answer was absolutely nonsensical, first of all. The ChatGPT answer was completely nonsensical. And the Google and the Google sources were 100% Christian. There was not one single Jewish source on this topic. So there is a reason for that. So I'm going to start out with that little fact. And that is that this is this is an under-discussed topic in Judaism because the answer is both very simple and very complicated. So I'm going to start out with the simple answer. Okay? The simple answer is we have no idea. That's the simple answer. The simple answer is we have no idea who is saved. We have no clue. Um, and I say that because we do not begin to understand the divine system of reward and punishment. The reason for that is because we are not because we're not omnipotent. Okay, we're not all powerful, and we're also not all knowing. So if we were both omniscient and omnipotent, we might be able to uh, understand what justice means and reward and punishment means for God. But because we're not, we have absolutely no idea. So I would say, first of all, that anybody who says that they know in particular whether any one person is going to be saved or not, that person is either lying to themselves, or lying to the other person, or probably both. That's the first thing. So I would say that the first and best answer is that we don't know. Now, having said that, just to clarify, we have some general ideas about what it is that God wants from us, and we have general ideas and even specific ideas about what God wants from us. And the idea is that if we fulfill those things, okay, then we fulfill those things, then we're going to get salvation. But there are also, I mean, if you kind of look into the tradition, you find there are all sorts of interesting exceptional stories. You know, the story about this. There's a Hasidic story about a man who was famous for being a miser, and he was such a miser. He was so horrible, and he was known to be such a miser that when they went to bury him, they buried him uh, upside down, right? Face down. That is like a really horrible thing to do to a person, right? It's just a nasty thing to do to a person. They buried him, right? The people of the town hated him so much they buried him upside down. So the after the man was buried, the local rabbi had a dream, and the man came from the dream and said, you've done me an injustice. And the rabbi searches this out and finds out that really this guy was extremely generous. It's just that he was generous in such a way that nobody knew about it, right? He was very, very careful to make sure that nobody had any idea about his generosity because he never wanted to be thanked for it. And he acted like a miser, right? And he made a big deal out of being a miser. And if anybody asked him, right? Anybody asked him in public for a donation, he'd always say no. But then he would find the person and he would give the donation in private and swear that they should never tell anybody. So we have all these stories that tell us that we don't know what we're looking at when we see another human being. That even though we have a set of guidelines, we don't know necessarily how things are weighed by God. Um, and there are general guidelines to these stories, I would say. And one of the guidelines is that very rare, almost always, when we hear these stories, um, the person is rewarded not for hidden prayers, but for hidden generosity. They're not what we normally think of as piety is not necessarily what especially rewarded or arouses God's mercy, but the things that we do for other people, acts of generosity, acts of kindness, and so on. Having said that, okay, so that's my caveat, and that's my caveat in the beginning. In general, Judaism understands that there are two legitimate religions in the world. Okay, there are two legitimate ethical systems in the world. So one is very small, um, and that's what most people would call Judaism, right? And that is the 613 laws that were revealed by Moses on Mount Sinai. It's um, a kind of rigorous religious way of life that is that is that is special and reserved for the descendants of Jacob and for those people who attach themselves to the descendants of Jacob, to the children of Israel, which would be people who convert, who become included, who now become uh, naturalized citizens, so to speak, um, in Bnei Yisrael and the children of Israel. And that is one path, to salvation. So, seemingly, a person who sincerely followed the 613 laws, or as many of them as they were able to keep, because it's not possible for everybody to keep all of them, because some of them are for kings and priests and also different kinds of people, some for women, some for men, that can't really keep all 613. But as many as you can, if you were to observe those sincerely with love and fear, then you would get your chelek be'olam haba. You would share in the world to come. You would have your share in the world to come. We're going to call that salvation for right now. Okay? Your share in the world to come, which is under discernment. That's part of the reason why we can't really find this on Google, and why poor ChatGPT just didn't know what to do with it. Because we don't have many descriptions of what that salvation is like, right? We don't have elaborate descriptions of paradise, of what the world to come is like, and rabbis discuss it, but they disagree. There are disagreements about exactly what that's like. Um, the second legitimate religion, okay, and the second pathway to salvation is what we call the Noahide path, the path that was revealed to the prophet Noah. And in this path consists of seven seven commandments, and those seven commandments are very, very big, right? So even though they say, okay, it's only seven commandments, those seven commandments involve things like not stealing, right? So not stealing is actually a very big topic, right? What does it mean, right? What that involves, all business ethics and all of those things. It involves involves not killing, not harming animals, um, and these seven ethical principles, including the belief in one God, okay, so there's also a theological principle there. So we have six ethical principles and one theological principle, two theological principles. Not allowed to blaspheme God. So those are two. So two theological principles and five ethical principles, which are all very big and very broad and covers a lot of human behavior. A person who follows that path has also their chelek b'olam haba. They also have. They're considered to be tzaddikim umot olam, to be righteous people of the nations, and they have a share. They have their share in the world to come. Therefore, they have salvation. Now, that so for example, okay, for example, which is makes a lot of sense in our conversation here, right? A person who is a Muslim, for example, who believes in one God, believes in not blaspheming God, and all the other seven principles, by that principle, right, is a follower is a bona fide follower of Noach, right? It includes the religion of Noach, and so therefore that person would have salvation, right? Similarly, um, other people in the world who would follow those basic principles, they would have salvation. Now, I mean, it is kind of it's an interesting topic because the question of what that religion, what that's supposed to look like, can, you know, is there supposed to be some separate kind of religion, or there are all sorts of things, um, and it's a political issue also, I'm going to add. It's a political issue because residence in the land of Israel is determined by the status of the person in terms of being a follower of the Noahide religion, right? So essentially, it's like Ahl Kitab, right? People who are. It's very similar. These are people who need to be protected. These are people who need to be protected. They can have full rights. They're part of the society, and so on. And so, the question about whether or not you want to include Muslims in that right now has a political dimension to it. But I think that, I'm just speaking personally. I don't think that really holds a lot of water. I think it's very clear that a Muslim would qualify as a Noahide, and therefore would have Chelek Lamaba, would have their share in the world to come. But as I said, so now, and one of the questions that came up last week, and I think actually stimulated this thought in me, was the question about what about the person who never heard of any of this stuff? They live in the jungles of Borneo, okay? They never heard of Moses, they never heard of Muhammad, they never heard of the Noahide laws, they never heard of any of these things, right? None of these things are so. Does that mean that they don't have no possibility of salvation? Um, I cannot believe that the one thing I know about God is that God is just and that God is merciful. Two things I know. Okay, and neither His justice nor His mercy um, seems reasonable to condemn people for something that they can't possibly be responsible for. So. Um, if I had to assume, and this is not a question that's actually taken up by anybody, which is interesting. I couldn't find a single scholar who has actually answered this question. So it's interesting. I don't know why it's never come up, but it seems an obvious question. And I would say the answer is that there's a human standard of good and evil. There's a human standard of good and evil. And that person would be expected to live up to that human standard of good and evil. And the theological aspect, I don't think they could be responsible for. I I don't think they could be responsible for the theological aspect, but they could be responsible for what I think is common human ethics. That's my best shot for that. Um, so I'll I'm going to conclude because really at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, we really don't know. As I said, we have these basic guidelines, that if a person is an ethical monotheist, um, whether it's a Jewish ethical monotheist, or whether it's a Muslim or Christian ethical monotheist, or maybe Sikhs, I don't know, maybe some other kind of ethical monotheist, that person is assured a chelek be'olam haba, a share in the world to come. Um, which doesn't mean that we can assume that the rest are doomed, right? Because there are a lot of things that we don't know, and there are lots of things. We see people who we think, are very pious and wonderful and amazing, and maybe they're not so pious and wonderful, amazing in certain areas of their life, and who knows? And there are other people we might look at, and they don't look to be so pious and wonderful, amazing, and they may be much more, and they may be facing things that we have never faced, right? We don't know what people's obstacles are. It may be, you know, it's you know, it may be that something is very easy for me, and very difficult for someone else, and so in God's calculation and God's understanding of our merits, it's very difficult to know. It's very difficult to know what the merits of another person are. So I suggest that we assume that everybody that we should assume that if we don't know, which we don't, we should assume that though we guide people to the good as best as we can, we should not assume that we know their fate, um, and be humble about it, uh, and uh, and I'll stop there before I jabber on too much.
Oh wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Rabbi Wiseman. You made such powerful points, and thank you for sharing your wisdom and knowledge on this topic. Dr. Zaheer, do you have any questions or comments?
I think I have two questions. This was a very interesting presentation, and I agree with him. The answer to the question of who is going to get salvation is both simple and very complicated, and I think he's very rightly put it and described it. Uh, how in his tradition this unfolds, the simple aspect as well as the complicated aspect. My two questions are: one is regarding the seven principles of Noah. It's basically regarding Noah. We know, obviously, that Noah preceded Abraham, and he came uh, before him. And then what we might say, actually, it's one of the verses in the Quran which mentions that from amongst his progeny was Abraham, you know. So, but obviously, Abraham was not the only one. There were many others who just proliferated, uh, migrated. There's, all over the world. So my question is that uh, looking at it from this point of view, obviously God's special focus was on Abraham's progeny, and the children of Israel were very prominent in that they received within, their family, their nation, prophets after prophets. Uh, but the part of humanity that was not belonging to this family, and it just multiplied and you know migrated to different parts of the world. These seven principles that he's mentioned, it is uh, quite possible. That's what I think. That these principles were there with everybody because you know I mean, if we go by the assumption, and I still believe that the assumption is correct, that at the time of the flood of Noah, that was the total world population, and the survivors uh, were what humanity constituted at that time, and then they multiplied. So obviously, this assumption may or may not be correct, but I still feel that it is correct. Given that assumption, uh, would Rabbi Weissman agree that the entire humanity had an understanding, even if it had weakened with the passage of time, of these principles, and therefore, when this process of accountability would take place, it will have both aspects: the aspect of these principles being there in some part of their memory, but then obviously the other possibility, the other aspect is that uh, some part or a good part of it they may have forgotten. And as he rightly said, that God, being just and merciful, he'll hold accountable people only to the extent that they knew, and nothing that was beyond their reach will be a cause for them to be doomed or punished. So does it make sense? I mean, I'm trying to infer from what he has said, and I want his comments on it.
Yeah, yeah, it does make sense. I mean, there is I think there is a kind of universal morality, right? And I, I tend to think, that human beings, before they dispersed, all over the world, right? They had a certain teaching, right? And I think that's why we call it, I think that's exactly why we call it the law of Noah, right? Because that's the teaching, that was the teaching that was given to Noah and his children, and so was kind of carried on. Now, it's kind of carried to wherever it is that they went, and of course, to some extent, forgotten in many places. Sometimes it's the theological piece that's forgotten, um, whereas the ethical piece very rarely is. I mean, in most societies don't believe in murder, don't really believe in stealing, right? Most societies have some kind of legal system, which is one of the requirements of the seven Noahide laws, is to have a legal system, a system of judgment. So I think that that's generally true, and I think that there is that. And then what happens in the case of Abraham is that Abraham gets a kind of revised version of the Noach Law, which is much sharper. It puts the theology in much sharper focus, and of course that ends up both with that both ends up with Bnei Israel and with the children of Jacob, the children of Yitzhak, and also with the children of Ishmael. Right? We know, right? We know that there were this is for lack of a better word, you know, Abrahamites. Long before Islam, there were people who were Ibrahimi,
Yeah,
long before Islam. So so yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think there is that Noahide core of things is still very much alive in the folklore and in the folklore and philosophies of people all over the world. I think it's there are remnants of it everywhere.
great. The other thing that I wanted to ask was something that I've already asked, but I would ask again
Try
because
again.
I want I want I want clarity on it because it's so important
Mm.
for us to somehow get some um, clarity on this question, which is an important question. I mean, um, Rabbi Weissman, he mentioned about one of the seven principles, God, oneness of God, which is obviously something that um, Judaism emphasizes, Islam emphasizes. And then I asked him about his understanding about those people, like many Hindus who worship statues. And
Mm.
so, what I understood from his answer and what I inferred was that uh, God knows that these people have been brought up in a different environment, and right from the early upbringing, childhood days, they have been looking at their ancestors worshipping several gods, so to say. Uh, but God knows what's going through their minds, what exactly is their spirit, uh, and they do have some hope. So I try to figure it out this way that you know they while they are doing it, they are actually on the one hand following the spirit of a creator that they are pursuing, but on the other hand, they are wondering why all this, and probably to some of them, this internal struggle might turn out to be a reason for them to earn the pleasure and love and respect of the Almighty. Because as he's rightly pointed out, different people have different circumstances. So if somebody was born and brought up in an environment which did not have the law, the teachings which are, so to say, ideal, uh, he should clearly not get the disadvantage of being there because clearly it was not his decision. So my question is, uh, well, on the one hand, this important principle, call it theological or whatever, but it is there and it's important and emphasized that there is only one God. And yet we find there are millions and millions of people who are brought up and in an environment where this principle is not quite as clearly understood and emphasized. Uh, how do we feel, quite apart from the fact that obviously God knows everything and he will decide, but sometimes you want to know the details of how how is he going to decide uh, favorably, at least in the case of some of them.
Yeah, I would, it's interesting. I did my PhD work in South Asian studies, specializing in Hinduism, right? So, and I spent 6 years in South India, so I have a little experience in this in this field, and it's interesting. You know, I found that many Hindus, for example, do struggle actually with this issue. Um, And at one point or another, we'll kind of like struggle with, okay, I grew up in a tradition that, that worshiped in this particular way. This is how my parents did it, my grandparents did it. And, I have an intuition that tells me, that it's not possible or probable for, an infinite God to limit itself to a finite image. Um, and they do go through, they do go through theological crises over things like that. Sometimes it's resolved for them because it is such a common question that they're kind of like philosophical answers to it. You say, well, okay, it's a symbolic representation. It's not actually the God. The God, of course, is the God. God, of course, is infinite and can't be contained in an image. But this is a kind of a way of focus because we're human beings. We need something to focus on. This is our object of focus. There are lots of different ways of doing that, and I don't know how I don't know how God kind of works that out. Like, the person who sees the person who sees the image as being a symbolic representation and not being a god, and not being a god incarnate, is that something that is that it's I don't know. It's an interesting question, but it does. I mean, I think that um, the people who kind of are able to, you know, listen, if you're raised in a monotheistic tradition and you end up being a monotheist, it's not such a big claim. But if you're raised in a polytheistic tradition and you manage to kind of to come to monotheism, I think that's quite an accomplishment.
Mm.
I think it's quite an accomplishment. Um, and I mean, I feel like from my days doing that, I was always surprised at how many kind of closet monotheists there were. I mean, how many people actually kind of approach things with a monotheistic kind of mindset, and it was surprising to me. It was surprising to me. Um, there are a lot more monotheists among Hindus than most people know. Um, so even that we can't know, right? Even that,
Right.
how much do we know about people's theology? A teacher of mine once asked me. He said, "When you pray, do you ever feel like there's something like you're standing in front of something?" And he said, "Yes." And he says, "What is it like?" And I said, "It's big, it's grand." He said, "Aha, so it's an idol." And I said, "What?" He says, "If you think you're standing before something which is big, okay, big is a category of material things, okay? So what you've got in front of you is an idol. You gotta get rid of that, you know? And so I think that among believers, right, among monotheistic believers, there are a lot of people who are not so monotheistic. I mean, whose conceptions of God may be seriously flawed, and there may be people among the people you wouldn't expect who have cleaner theologies than that we might expect. So that's
Yeah,
that's my
yeah.
answer.
I, it's strange, and it probably it somewhat explains um, what we might call the Almighty's fairness in the manner He has caused people to go through the trial of this life. Uh, I can tell you that despite a very strong emphasis on oneness of God in the Quran and the Islamic tradition, uh, many Muslims, large number, I don't want to say the majority, but a very large number of Muslims who have lived in India and subcontinent alongside the Hindus have actually been influenced by the
Oh, yeah.
Hindu approach towards religion, and they cannot be, those Muslims cannot be actually described as qualifying to be monotheists. So, as you rightly said, God is going to decide at the end of the day who has done what, and what exactly is the value of their performance in His eyes. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's true.
that is certainly true. That's certainly true. Ms. Dr. Lale.
Wow, I mean, honestly, this discussion is amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Zaheer, for your comments. I love everything you said. We just don't know. And there's something in the verse in the Quran about this as well, I think, where, in the hellfire, we will see people that we didn't expect to be there, and the same in paradise. So we just don't know. And God, God knows everybody's hearts. I believe that we all have unique gifts, blessings, talents, and God knows each of our potentials as to how we can, use those to worship Him. And one person's potential might be higher than someone else's. So from the outside, it might look like someone's not doing as well as someone else, but actually they might be doing better in the eyes of God. And I believe that the more knowledge we have, the more responsibility we have. So, if one person is more aware of what God's commandments are, then they have more of a duty and responsibility to fulfill those. And therefore, I loved what you said about the person in the jungle who can't, read, who doesn't know about the prophets, know about the scriptures, the commandments. I believe that God will judge every soul according to its capacity, and that it says in the Quran as well that no soul will be tasked beyond their capacity. So I have a question. You mentioned about the 613 commandments for the Jews, for Judaism, for salvation, and the 7 Noahide commandments for everyone else. But from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is it that how at the moment, because there's no temple, it's not possible to do the 613 commandments, is it?
No, well,
And what happens?
even before the temple, it was not possible because not all the 613 actually are going to apply to you, right? Some of them are going to apply
For
to,
women and men, there's different.
right, some are for men, some are for women, some are for Kohanim, for priests. And many of them, as you rightly say, many of them are related to the temple, and they can't be done until this temple. So, it's as many of them as apply today, right? As many of them as you can possibly, do today.
So it's not the actual 613 commandments, but it's what you can do out of those.
Right,
So
what you can do, right?
according to what you can do. Okay. And my other question is about I've been trying to figure this out. Is the whole, there's a lot of teaching from rabbis about the Noahide commandments and that type of thing. When I read the Quran and I see, it says my understanding of, Islam is that it's not meant to have been a new religion formed after Muhammad, peace be upon him, but that in the Quran, please correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Zaheer, from my understanding, in the Quran it says we inspired you, Muhammad, to follow the religion of Abraham, and it describes the religion of Abraham, peace be upon him, as, that he was a Muslim. And that my understanding is that the term Muslim actually means, somebody who surrenders to a higher truth, or that path of truth, and submits to that path, and that's the path of peace. So, and it also describes that this path was that Islam is the religion of Noah and all the prophets. So, I think this is a really, we should talk about this more. but then elsewhere it says that, you know, the Quran was given to the Arab-speaking people, and but then elsewhere it says it's a mercy for all mankind. Could it be that actually it's a scripture that is meant to be a mercy for the whole world, to bring people back to that Noahide religion? I don't know. I'm asking what you think about that.
This is a question actually that the scholar Maimonides actually talked about this. So Maimonides, who lived, he was a doctor in the court of Saladin, and lived in Egypt. And one of the things he says, you know, he says that both Christianity and Islam, you know, have brought the essential teachings of monotheism to everybody in the world, you know. And in a certain sense, they did the job that we were supposed to do. Right? I'm sorry to say. I admit failure where failure is what's been accomplished. And, you know, we did not manage to bring the ethical monotheism to the rest of the world, but Islam and Christianity did. Islam more successfully in the sense that it preserved the theology. So yeah, I think that's essentially true, and I think that that's an interesting, you know, it's interesting take on it. You know, the idea that it's not a new religion. It's interesting. I was once talking to a rabbi friend, and he was very upset because he went to some interfaith gathering, and the imam who was talking about Islam said that Abraham Abraham was a Muslim. You know, he said, "Can you believe that he said that? Everybody knows that Abraham is the first Jew." And I said, "Wait a second, just slow down, okay? Slow down." Said, "Did Abraham ever call himself a Jew?" No, the tribe of Yehuda didn't exist yet. Okay, so for sure he wasn't the first Jew. Okay, we know that because, okay, was he the first follower of Moses? That's another definition of Jewish. Was he the first follower of Moses? No, Moses wasn't born yet. So I said, well, okay, so what was he? He said, oh, yeah, okay. So he was, and I said, yes, that's what they're calling Muslim. I said, right, is a person who submitted, it's a person submitted to God. So when you say that Abraham is the first Jew, and when they say that Abraham was a Muslim, you mean exactly the same thing. It doesn't mean that he exactly followed the Sharia, right, revealed to Muhammad. It means that he practiced the basic religion, right?
Yeah,
He practiced the basic religion, which kind of runs through all of these Abrahamic religions. There's a very clear
exactly.
there's a clear theology. There's a clear set of practices, even prayer, fasting. We could list them, um, which which run through, and then there are variations in the way that we do it. You know, do you pray 3 times a day? Pray 5 times a day? Do you how exactly do you work out exactly do you work out the times? What days do you fast, and so forth? All of that is different, but you're still praying, you're still fasting, you're still believing in one God, and you're doing essentially the same practices. And so I would say that it's fair to say that, Abraham inherits that Noahide tradition, and brings something else to it, right? He brings a kind of energy to it that didn't exist before, and that energy gets spread to the children of Ishmael, the children of Yitzhak, and eventually, ends up all over the world, really through Islam.
Amazing. And I think perhaps even in Hinduism, there's elements of, I see sort of like that Abrahamic concepts in Hinduism. You know, even, you know, the names Brahman and da, da, da. And I think it's important to look at Hinduism I don't know much about anything really, but I've spoken to some Hindus about it, and actually many Muslims, I think, misunderstand what Hinduism is, and they think it's all about idol worship. But actually, if you go into it, I think some of these gods are not, they're just meant to be like attributes of our creator, and representations of those attributes, which even people can represent. So I don't know. God knows best. I need to use my
there's
knowledge more
also,
about this topic.
I mean, there's in practical terms, you know, in practical terms, there's a huge influence of Islam. You know, it's interesting. In South Asia, there's a huge impact, obviously, of Hinduism on South Asian Islam, right? As Dr. Zaheer said, you know, the way they treat the dargahs and the graves and all the stuff. And there's definitely
There's a lot of there's a lot
yeah,
of
there's a lot of Hindu influence in things like
definitely.
that, but there's also a lot of Muslim influence on beginning in the Middle Ages on Hinduism too. Um, and there is a kind of monotheistic shift actually in the Middle Ages because of the kind of challenge of Islam. Um, the theologies kind of move towards monotheism. So you have Hindu sects which are theoretically monotheistic. I mean, kind of interesting, right? Are theoretically monotheistic. They preserve the you know the worship of images and things like that. But if you ask them at a philosophical level, they're going to describe something that's if not monotheistic, at least monistic, right? Or, you know, or monolatry, the worship of one God. So it's
And also,
an interesting topic.
it is interesting. And also, doesn't Abraham, peace be upon him, come from, his father was, you know, an idol, you know, they used to make idols, and wasn't he sort of helping with that during his childhood until he sort of used his mind and started
So
thinking, asking
he
questions?
figured it out. It's like,
Yeah, exactly. So perhaps there's, you know, if we reflect on that, then maybe, you know, the message here is that we use our mind to try and ask questions and seek higher truth, and use our logic and reason to try and understand better. And, you know, there's always new truth that can be revealed to us, higher truth. And as long as we're sort of trying to follow that path of higher truth and try to lead our lives accordingly, then my understanding is that that is what, you know, Islam is. You know, a child who doesn't know, are they going to go to hell? Do they not get salvation? You know, if they're
right. And so,
you know, to do all these things, and they don't know because they don't have the role models. They might steal and lie and think that that's okay, but they're a child, and they don't yet know. You know, perhaps.
what do you talk what but even a child, you know, a child has been miseducated in some kind
Exactly.
of way. I mean, what
And
do you
people,
expect?
yeah, and people go through traumatic childhoods, and everybody's got their own struggles, and who are we to judge anybody?
True indeed.
Yeah, that's it.
Well,
Thank you
thank you so
so much.
much.
Thank you. God
Thank you.
bless you. I'm looking forward to hearing your perspective next week, Dr. Zaheer, as well.
Thank
And
you.
thank you both so much.
Okay. And meanwhile, I'll be thinking of the next really, really difficult topic. Work
Thank
on
you
it.
very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Peace and blessings. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah.
Oh.